So folks know 6:30 right now. We're going to start about 5 minutes for a bit, meaning that down front. There are some seats here and there. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I was worried that no one was going to show up to this thing. My name is Ben Eagerman. I am a librarian here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. I'm really, really happy to welcome you to our program From Twilight to Sunshine, LGBTQ plus history in the Baltimore metropolitan region. You're going to be hearing from me, from two community members who have been leading history walking tours for a while, Lewis and Richard, and from my colleague Lisa, who also works here in the Central Library. Also, big shout out to Lisa, who has been doing a lot of the heavy lifting of putting this program together. So I would like to ask for a little round of applause for her. The way that this is going to work, we're going to have Lewis up to talk about the more recent history of the building of a lot of the institutions that we take for granted, perhaps, or don't know the history of, and how those came to be. We're then going to sort of back up a little. Well, actually a lot. We're going to back up all the way to the 1830s and talk about how we got to that point in the 70s where we were comfortable starting activist organizations where we could do that. Before I go into it, a quick thing, obviously, very, very sort of packed group here, which is wonderful, but we are going to ask people to hold their questions to the end, just for the sake of time. I'm going to quickly shout out two lovely resources that we have here. The first is a lovely map of about 350 sites associated with LGBTQ plus history across Maryland. Full disclosure, I made the map. I'm very happy about it. I'm very proud of it. And the other is something we have online on our site, Digital Maryland, called the Maryland Rainbow History Collection. If you actually look up Digital Maryland and go to it for this month, you will see it front and center. It is a series of oral histories of community activists, including Lewis and Richard. And it's certainly something worth listening to, worth hearing. With that said, I would like to welcome Lewis up here to tell us about some of the more recent stuff.
Thank you, everybody. And I'd like to recognize in the audience another co-founder of the Pride Center, Silas White. Would you stand, raise your hand? He's been around. And surprisingly enough, I'm not originally from Maryland. I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, and came to Maryland 53 years ago. So, but I came out in Maryland, so maybe it was my rebirth city. And I stayed, so that's a good thing. And I'm so glad to see the turnout today. And in the center, Silas is in this picture, and I'm on the far end. And this shows the diversity of the young people that were dedicated. And we thought there was more life than just in the bars. in 1975, and we did something about it. We started meeting in somebody's living room on the second floor, and that's at 929 North Charles Street, between the mansion and the Hippo, which is now CVS. But around the corner, and you'll see a lot of CVSs replacing good gay places. But but I won't get on CVS's case. But there are 2 seats in the front if you want to come sit down, and there's 1 seat over here if you like a single. And the second picture is our first attendance at New York's Gay Pride, and we called ourselves the Baltimore Gay Alliance. And there are some of the co-founders are behind the banner, and actually someone that wrote the grant for Chase Brexton being found and won the grant, a pre-med student at Johns Hopkins in our group called Gail Davino, but you'll see a house for her later on. We had our first gathering at and many gatherings at the Washington Monument, and seems always to be a gathering spot in Mount Vernon. And we actually, Richard and I participated in a tour with people from Europe and Russia, and St. Petersburg people like to pose in front of the Washington Monument, and the architecture is it seems very Europe to them. And of course, they like to smoke outdoors. they didn't get used to that too easy. This is the site of the 400 block of East 31st Street, and this used to be the location of the 31st Street bookstore, and lesbian-owned and run bookstore with very strong lesbian feminist presence, and located at 423 East 31st Street. And the 31st Street bookstore was established in 1973, and it closed in 1995. And it was sold to the owners of Llamas Bookstore in Washington, D.C., and relocated eventually down to Mount Vernon. We found a lot of comfort around 31st Street. There were institutions like Bread and Roses, a lot of meeting places in that area, and it was the site of the first block party after the Gay Pride demonstration downtown, our first gay celebration downtown. And we always felt comfortable in that area, and had our first what's called a block party in blocking across 31st Street at Greenmount. One of the institutions there was Sam's Food Co-op, and Bread and Roses was the other institution across the street from the 31st Street bookstore. And there was a strong presence of gay life. This is where Diana Press used to be at 25th and North Charles. That location, and also the alternative gay paper, was in the same block. And we had a large presence around 25th Street. This is the location of the Lesbian Community Center, and a Women's Journal of Liberation, at 3028 Greenmount Avenue, around the corner from the 31st Street bookstore. The Legend Community Center was founded in 1974, and from 1974 until 1977, it was located at 101 East 25th Street, which we saw in the other slide. Oops. And yeah, okay. Oops, I don't know how I did that. Wait a moment. Let's see. I was trying to get back to the community center, but there it is. And this existed for the health of women and was a very strong people community health center. And a lot of feminists and anti-war activists and Black Panthers. It closed in 2014. And there was a lesbian center, switchboard, social groups and events, and entirely run by volunteers on a low budget. And this is one of the Gay Community Center's early locations. It's on Maryland Avenue, 2133. And on this right side is the start, one of the early locations of the gay VD clinic, which then became Chase Brexton when it moved to 241 West Chase Street. And this location, on one half, on the right side, was the clinic. On the left side was the meeting area where we got out of the living room and got in to be in existence. There was on 31st Street an office we rented because we just wanted a semblance that we were business-like and not always in somebody's living room. There are 2 seats up front here if you want to sit. And you can come and relax. And maybe they'll get some more seats. Standing room only. This is a good thing. This is 27th Street and Calvert in the Charles Village. And this is the basement where we had a switchboard. We printed the gay paper. And this was space in a house that was owned by the person that wrote the grant, the winning grant for Chase Brexton, or the VD clinic that went on to become Chase Brexton. This is Metropolitan Community Church. It's a location where many groups met, and Metropolitan Community Church was there 3 different times. It's one of the oldest religious groups on the East Coast. The Metropolitan Community Church of Washington was founded in 1971, and in 1972, the Baltimore Metropolitan Community Church, and they just celebrated their 50th anniversary last year. And I got the pleasure of attending that church with my mother and having great religious experience because I'm from a family with many ministers. So, and it's in my will. I'm leaving things to Metropolitan Community Church. This is the 900 block on the corner of West Eager Street, and this is the Club Hippo. And if you look to the right, you'll see the CVS that it is now today, another CVS. But the Hippo was founded in 1971, and a lot of events were happening there. I have to bring the point up that I'm a man of color, And the hippo was very prejudiced to the gay community, to my mother, who was denied entrance because she didn't have ID, and I was her 30-some-year-old son. So it couldn't be negative birth years. But I took her back home and got her ID and came back. But I never forgot that. And I wasn't sad when the hippo closed. You get to pay back for that. But I met people and dated them and had celebrations there, and it was a good place to go to. But discos come and go too. Okay.
Yeah, thank you again, Louis. What I always love about hearing this is when we're talking about this history in Baltimore, we are not talking about big, impressive buildings and huge organizations with a lot of money. We're talking about people coming together in people's homes, churches, and these small offices, and really coming together very early on and building something that we really enjoy now today as well. But let's rewind a little bit. So when we're looking at queer history, LGBTQ history, a lot of what we're going to find is stuff that's basically from newspapers, and specifically how newspapers, along with the sort of industrialization in the 1800s, helps people go from this idea of like, well, we all know that like people who we would now see as members of our community, well, we've always existed. But we see people going from the idea of themselves as an individual to an identity, to some feeling like they are a type of individual, and that there are other people like this. And then ultimately, we're going to see it as it develops into from an identity into a community. All right. But let's start. When I'm saying these sort of, well, in the 1830s, specifically, I think this is 1838. It's like a year or two after the Baltimore Sun actually starts publishing. They run this story of someone named George Wilson, who, in the parlance of the time, they say was discovered effectively to be a assigned female at birth. Now, George Wilson was a British sailor who was hanging out in Baltimore, went to sell a horse. It was stolen and and he was caught. Again, they bring him to the police station and make the revelation and say, "What is your name?" And George Wilson says, "My name is George Wilson, and I will go by no other name." In fact, if you look at the records, I did actually talk to someone who worked at the Maryland State Archive about this. They are written down very strangely as like in a register, it'll say like prisoner George Wilson, female, right? So they legitimately did not have another name for this person. When in prison, again, refused to wear dresses, refused to follow orders, basically was just not, they didn't like George. They didn't like George at all. And they said, we don't know what to do because he's lived as a sailor for years. So he seems pretty hardened to things, right? Like, they figured out a plan though, that they would do. They asked the governor for a pardon on the condition that George go back to England and never come back. And so this is a quote of it, but again, you see the prisoner, a female calling herself George Wilson, has been acting as a man and for most part a sailor for 7 or 8 years. This isn't someone who was, sort of in disguise for a moment. This is someone who had been living, their experience as George Wilson. Well, this isn't the only story. And as we move forward, we see things get a little more interesting. We start looking towards the idea of an identity more. So I love this story. This is Howard Calder. And Howard was from a wealthy family in Harford County. And he was in love with the girl next door. He went to the priest and said, this is what's happened to me. I'm a man now. It's a strange miracle. Miracles happen. Sensation, which you might imagine, right? But they were actually, a lot of these articles were fairly positive, much more comfortable as a man. That's literally in the this is from that and then what he did is that he had found about a case of a person who's likely intersex who effectively transitioned later in life, that had happened in Virginia. And he brought that to the priest and said, this is the type of person that I am as well, right? Said, this is a type of person and I am that type of person. And the priest said, oh, well, I do see that this is a type of person. I guess that is possible. Well, let's see what's next. Again, eventually they wind up going to court. It's a big drama. They do get split up. But you know, like it's again very strange. Some of them are not very positive, such as girls marry each other, or the probably worst one, which just is let's see here. Yeah, the man woman. That one was not great. However, what's amazing is that throughout this, they actually interviewed him. And so he said, I will tell you why I left home. I was a girl until I was about 25 years old. Then I noticed a change coming in my sex. I was becoming a man. I certainly have been one for over 10 years. And you can look at this and say, this seems pretty modern, right? This seems like there are some really obvious parallels to the way people still talk about their own process of transitioning. And this is what it looked like to come out as trans in the pages of the Baltimore Sun in 1889, right? Well, and here's some more about what, you know, this is actually the person on the right is a similar case of a different person. But I do like it just because, again, it is a photograph. It shows you around this time period what it looked like for a trans man to be living and out in the world. Well, that's sort of what's happening there. Across the state, things are happening. William Dorsey Swan is a fairly interesting figure who's born enslaved in Maryland, and then moved to first the DC suburbs and then DC, where he got into a lot of trouble for, well, organizing parties as a drag queen, and like really early drag balls. You can see on the right, it says the Queen rated, and he called him like the parties drags. So literally was the first person to call himself a drag queen. Consistently arrested throughout the 1880s and 1890s for throwing these drag balls. Did petition the president for a pardon. I don't know if he actually got one. And there is a book, hopefully will come out. He's been working on it for quite a while, but there's a book about him that should come out soon. And of course, there's similar stories across Maryland and actually quite a few in Baltimore as well. And what's important about this is if there was an identity there with Howard Calder, well, what he wasn't doing was just coming out. He was organizing parties. And in order to have a party, you need a group of people who you can talk to, who you know might actually want to come to such an event. And that is called the earliest parts of a community, right? And so this is where we see suddenly we're no longer looking at individuals who are largely trying to, well, pass, but looking at people getting together and sort of doing their own thing. By the 1930s, so skipping forward a little bit, those communities had grown tremendously. And this became super clear in the case of what's called the pansy craze. Raise your hand. Does anyone know what the pansy craze was? Okay, yeah, Louis, that doesn't count. I mean, so the pansy craze was this obsession nationwide with drag. Huge shows, coast to coast. They were in early Hollywood movies. They were in plays. They were in all these things. One of the biggest stars was Carol Norman, who was from East Baltimore. Was was never closeted. It wasn't coming out in the newspaper, but all of the interviews that were ever done with people who worked with him said, "Oh yeah, everyone knew he was gay. No one had a problem." Now that said, they're talking about people working in vaudeville and theater, where it was probably a lot more normal. But in terms of the pansy craze here in Baltimore, it wasn't mostly found with people like Carol Norman. Instead, it was largely found in West Baltimore, where there was a group of queens starting to throw regular drag balls. And what's amazing about this is not only was this happening, it was getting covered extensively by the Baltimore Afro. You know, again, it wasn't exactly positive coverage all the time. You know, the pansy craze, is it entertainment or just plain filth? But they did cover it and talk about it almost as if it were like a high class society event. They would talk about the beautiful draping gowns and jewelry and how made up people were, and really like talking about the sort of pageantry of it. But what's amazing to me again is that two drag queens who were performing in West Baltimore in the other, it didn't invite quite the same level of crackdown and repression in Baltimore as it did in other cities, most notably DC. And so oftentimes performers from all around would come to Baltimore to perform. And then the last thing, I think that's my last bit. Yep. The last amazing happened after they published that article, The Pansy Craze, Is It Entertainment or Just Filth? One of the performers, Louis Stiggs, who is actually the one on the right there, wrote an editorial in response. It was called A Defense of Pansies by One of Them. And in it, we have, again, in the 1930s, a Black drag queen going into the newspaper and saying, yes, I am gay. Yes, I am a drag queen. And no, there's nothing wrong with that, which is something that we don't really think about when we think about the past and how attitudes towards our community have changed. With that said, all of this has been pulled from newspapers, but at all levels of society, in fact, there were plenty of LGBTQ plus people. And so I'm going to welcome Richard up to talk about some of the more well-established members of the community.
I'm going to talk about 5 people, and they all have one thing in common. It's an affiliation with Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Hospital. And they also have something to do with Maryland LGBTQ history. Hopkins was founded in 1876. The medical school didn't get off the ground until 1893, and there was a reason for that, and that was lack of money. It's hard to imagine nowadays that Hopkins didn't have much money, but that was true early in its history. So there were a group of 5 women who stepped forward and said, "We will help do the necessary fundraising to get the medical school off the ground if we meet these 2 conditions. One, we want the school to be graduate level. At that time, you didn't need to have a bachelor's degree to go to medical school at any American university. These women wanted to see the program elevated to graduate level. The second thing, and this was really the big make and break, they wanted the school to be open on an equal footing to women. And so the trustees, who may have had some mixed feelings but wanted the money, basically said that, well, we can deal with that. So the 5 women included Mamie Gwynn, who's the person on the left, who was born in 1861 and died in 1940. To your right, Mary Elizabeth Garrett, who was born in 1854 and died in 1915. And Martha Carey Thomas, who simply went as Carey, who was known as Carey, who was born in 1857 and died in 1935. The 2 women that I'm not going to talk about, and I'll just mention briefly, are Julia Rogers and Bessie King. This is a picture of the 5 women together. 4 of the 5 women came from families that had fathers who were Hopkins trustees. All of these families were affluent. All of the women had gone to school together as children. They got together on Friday nights to socialize, and they talked about books, so they called their group simply the Friday Night Group. So these were basically a group of affluent women of privilege, and Gwynn, Thomas, and Gwynn were 3 women whose emotional lives were intertwined for a long period of time. Mary Elizabeth Garrett Road. If you wondered how Garrett County got its name, it was because of just up the street at the corner of Cathedral and Monument. And if you can visualize where the hotel were, Garrett family mansion, money, so when each of Mary Elizabeth Garrett's brothers got married, that brother and his new brother, and that's the Garrett Jacobs mansion. The other Garrett brother got the Evergreen House, which is on Charles Street, just north of Cold Spring Lane. Mary Garrett, who was a lesbian, was an ardent feminist, and she used her considerable fortune to advance the vote. She died in 1915. The constitutional amendment that gave women the right to vote was ratified by Congress in 1920, so she never actually saw it clause. So that was Mary Elizabeth Garrett. Carrie Thomas was a pioneer in advocating the higher education for women. She earned her bachelor's degree at Radcliffe. She earned her bachelor's degree at Cornell. After she finished her bachelor's degree, she wanted to go to graduate school. At that time, and this was in the 1870s, no American graduate school was admitting women. So she went to Europe and she earned her PhD at the University of Zurich. After she came back to the States, she took a teaching appointment at Bryn Mawr College in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, which is the suburban Philadelphia area. It's one of those 7 sister elite women's colleges. She rose through the ranks. She went from being a professor to a dean to becoming the president of the school. And it was at her instigation that Bryn Mawr became the first American university that offered graduate level programs to women. She was able to go to Europe because she convinced her parents that if she went with Mamie Gwynn, that they would be able to do this together. Well, little did the parents know really why they were going, because these 2 women had an emotional attraction to one another since childhood. So the 2 women lived together as a couple in Zurich while 21 years. Most of that time in the president's mansion. Bryn Mawr had begun offering graduate level programs to women. Mamie Gwynn went to graduate school at Bryn Mawr. She earned a PhD in English, and then she joined the faculty at Bryn Mawr. In other words, both women had institutional affiliations with Bryn Mawr. Then in 1904, what did Mamie Gwynn do? Well, she decided to throw the world a curveball, and she scandalized the Bryn Mawr faculty. So what did she do? She ran off with Alfred Hodder. Alfred Hodder was one of her fellow English faculty members. So Mary Elizabeth Garrett entered into the picture because Carrie Thomas didn't waste any time. Carrie Thomas, during the years that she was involved with Mamie Gwynn, had sort of had something on the side with Mary Elizabeth Garrett. So exit Mamie Gwynn, enter Mary Elizabeth Garrett. So for the last 11 years of Mary Elizabeth Garrett's life, she lived with Mamie Gwynn in the president's residence on the Bryn Mawr campus. So in 1915, when Mary Elizabeth Garrett died, she left her considerable fortune, I think it was about $15 billion at that point, to Carrie Thomas. Well, Carrie Thomas was still the president of Bryn Mawr, and she had no use for the mansion at 101 West Monument Street, just up the street, which she inherited from Carrie Thomas. So what did she do with that? She let the Baltimore Museum of Art use that for its very first home. So the very first home of the BMA was just up the street at 101 West Monument. She let them use it for a couple of years for free. Then she sold it to the BMA. And then when the BMA moved up to Art Museum Drive, they sold it to a developer, and that developer put up the building, which is at that location well, it's the Hotel Revival. It was an apartment building for a long period of time. I guess for 20 plus years, it's been a hotel. So that's a bit about those three women. So now I will go on to Gertrude's. I missed. That's it. You see that little arrow? That's Baltimore's most famous medical school dropout. This is Gertrude Stein, who most of you, who if you knew Gertrude Stein's name, knew Stein as a writer, but Stein was a Baltimorean. She had deep Baltimore roots because her parents as well as grandparents were Baltimoreans. She, however, was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh. She spent some of her growing up years in Pennsylvania, some in Oakland, California, some in Europe. And after her mother died for a brief period of time, she lived in Reservoir Hill with a maternal aunt. She went to Radcliffe, and after she finished her bachelor's degree, she moved here to go to medical school at Hopkins. She entered medical school in 1897. She was in school at Hopkins until 1901. If you look at that picture, just look at all the people with white shirts. Those are the women in the class. If you look at the demographics of the class, you can see it's about 90% male. So from 1897 until 1900, she lived with her brother Leo, who was in a doctoral program in zoology at Hopkins I can never remember these addresses, 212 East Preston, which does have a historical plaque on it. So she and Leo lived together while they were both in graduate school. Then when he dropped out of his graduate program to move off to Paris, she moved in with one of her medical school classmates, and she lived at 212 East Eager Street, also again in Mount Vernon. She started out fairly well in medical school, but by her third year, her grades were beginning to decline. By her fourth year, she had a nasty spat with her obstetrics professor. Her grades were pretty crummy, so she dropped out of school. She was chafing against society's restrictions against women. So as a result, she learned to box. She refused to wear a corset, and she smoked cigars. She also had her first love affair with a woman, and it was a mess. She got involved with a woman named, wait, it gets better. She was involved with a woman named May Bookstaver. May Bookstaver had moved to Baltimore with her female partner, Mabel Haynes. Mabel Haynes had moved here to go to graduate school. So this is the way it worked. Gertrude was involved with May. May and Mabel were a couple, and Mabel and Gertrude were classmates together. So if you thought if you thought that you invented the word polyamorous, well, she beat you to it. So it was a bit of a mess. And so the period between 1901, when she dropped out of medical school, and 1903, when she moved to Paris, was a period of really despair and depression for her. She lived briefly in New York. She lived briefly in London. She was in Italy for a brief period of time. And then in 1903, she moved to Paris. What she was looking for was some sort of relief from the strictures that she felt in American life. And she really found that with the community of avant-garde artists and writers that she became a part of. I mean, she knew people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, and Henry Matisse. So some of her earliest apprentice writings reflected her experiences in Baltimore. For example, in 1903, she wrote a novella called Fernhurst. It was autobiographical based, so it was a fictionalized version of the May Bookstaver, Mabel Haynes, Gertrude Stein love triangle that I mentioned earlier. In 1904, she wrote another novella called QED. Again, that was a fictionalized version of the Mary Elizabeth Garrett, Alfred That Little Mess. So some of her earliest biographical experiences were reflected in her earliest writing. The very first novella that she wrote wasn't published until 1950. She died in 1946, and she admitted to an interviewer years later that after she wrote it, she stuffed it into a drawer because it just wasn't time to talk about things like that in our civilization. So during the time that she was in medical school, she became friends with Dr. Clarabelle Cohn. In this picture, Dr. Cohn's the person on my left. The person in the middle with the white hat with the headband is Gertrude Stein, and the person on the right with the outrageous black hat is Clarabelle's younger sister, Etta. So Gertrude Stein had become friends with both of the Cohn sisters, and after she moved to Europe, she continued her friendship with the Cohn sisters. The Cohn sisters had discretionary income because there was family money. In addition, Dr. Cohn was a doctor, so she had money of her own. So they had money to burn. They were going to Paris to visit Gertrude Stein. And who did Gertrude Stein know? She knew Picasso and she knew Matisse. This was at the time when both of those artists were young, starving artists. They were eager to sell their work. Here were the Cohn sisters eager to buy. They had Gertrude Stein as their intermediary. So what is one of the things that the Baltimore Museum is most proud of? It's that collection of Matisse. How did they get those? It was the long arm of Gertrude Stein because she knew Matisse and Picasso. The Cohn sisters were going to Europe. They were buying art directly from Matisse. They were bringing it back here. They displayed it on the walls of their home. They lived at the Marlborough Apartments, which are still there. They're on Utah Street, just above North Avenue and Reservoir Hill. They had that large collection of art displayed on their walls. Etta died second. Clarabelle died first. Etta died in 1950, and her will specifies to the Baltimore Museum of Art, but Matisse, it was really the long of Gertrude Stein. So finally, I'm just going to mention briefly John Money, who was a native of New Zealand. He moved to the States after he finished his bachelor's degree, and he attended Harvard. He earned a PhD at Harvard. And after he finished the PhD, he moved on to Baltimore to begin a teaching career at Hopkins that lasted for 55 years. He died at the age of 85, and at the time of his death, he was still teaching. He was a pioneering sexologist. Nowadays, we use those terms like gender role, gender identity, or sexual orientation. He was the person who coined all three of those phrases. The thing he should really be remembered for primarily, however, was that in 1965, he established Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic. He was a professor of medical psychology at Hopkins, and he established the Gender Identity Clinic, and it was an instigation that Hopkins performed the first gender confirmation survey that admitted women on an equal footing to men. It also has the distinction of an academic affiliation that 66. In 79, the psychiatrist who was head of psychiatry at the hospital was pretty adamantly opposed to seeing the surgeries continue. So they took a long hiatus from 1980 until 2016. They began again in 2017. They continue until this time. So what Money established in 1965 as the Gender Identity Clinic currently is called the Center for Transgender Health at Hopkins. So that's my bit. Lisa.
Well, everybody so far has talked about some pretty uplifting things. And unfortunately, I'm going to be talking about some more somber matters. I will be discussing the local structures of power as they interacted with the LGBTQ plus communities. The first anti-sodomy law in Maryland was enacted in 1793. Essentially what it says is that if any male person or any male servant or apprentice shall be convicted of sodomy, the said justices may pass such judgment as the law requires for such crimes. And that included punishments such as working on the roads or cleaning the Baltimore basin for not more than 7 years, as well as confinement. Believe it or not, this law survived in one form or another all the way until 2020, when it was repealed by the Maryland General Assembly. And we can thank Delegate David Moon, a Democrat from Tacoma Park, Maryland, for sponsoring the repeal. In the Maryland department where I work here at Pratt, we have annual reports from the Baltimore Police Commissioners, and we have them from 1862 to 1952. These reports list the arrests each year per criminal offense. So I was able to take those reports and make this graph showing sodomy arrests per year in Baltimore. And as there were no arrests from 1862 to about 1873, then you see an arrest, but the arrests remain pretty low through the 19th century. And the beginning of the 20th century, in 15, when we see a spike, and that it was coincident with the work of sort of where we end up with sort of a conflation scare with the Red Scare. As we shall see, the Red Scare overlapped quite a bit with the Lavender Scare. And I'll just say from this, not exclusively a gay thing, but charges of sodomy were used or often used to harass gays throughout a large part of the 20th century. Vice. In the early part of the 20th century, America experienced a moral panic. Vice commissions were set up in cities across the country, including Baltimore. The first commission being in Chicago, The major concerns were so-called white slavery and prostitution. And of course, this reflected an uneasiness with increasing urbanization and numbers of immigrants. And this cartoon appeared in 1913 in the Baltimore Sun. And the Maryland Vice Commission was appointed by Maryland Governor Goldsborough in 1913. Physician George Walker was appointed the chairman. It began to report out in 1915. Its main concern was heterosexual prostitution, whether to keep it segregated in vice districts or to break up vice districts where there would be like street walking and pimping. And it turns out that the reports of the Vice Commission were suppressed because of official embarrassment. And the Enoch Pratt Library, Maryland Department, is thought to have the only extant copy of the typewritten manuscript. So we can learn a lot looking at this about official attitudes towards LGBTQ people in that period of time. There's an appendix to the report entitled Sexual Perversion Homo Sexuality. It really provides a window in, as I said, into official attitudes at the time. The report said that in a recent summer, police arrested 25 men on male prostitution-related charges. Most of the arrests were made on Charles Street, Franklin Street, and Mulberry Street. Well, it's around where we're sitting right now. Then the appendix digresses from prostitution and treats homosexuality itself. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it because it's quite humorous. As a rule, men of this type are distinct from the normal individual and can be easily recognized on the street. Their peculiarities are feminine mannerisms, as shown in the gait and the movement of the head and the hands, in their rather high-pitched voice, simulating a woman's, and in the choice of words, such expressions as "how charming," "most enchanting," "gorgeously delicious," and and "oh my dear" are frequently used. They are strikingly verbose and nearly always speak in superlatives. They are much addicted to letter writing, and their epistles are long and filled with various veiled references to their practices. The method of perversion which they use varies with different individuals or different sets of individuals, and for obvious reasons will not be described here. And then it goes on for a few pages, and then there's a section on homo-sexuality among women. And I'm going to quote from that. "It has not been possible to investigate this carefully, but with very little effort, we have discovered several striking examples. Two well-known women who are engaged in various affairs about the city are perverts. A set of three others, one in a very responsible position and one in a minor position, all have perverted relations among themselves. There are numerous young women who are guilty of this practice. Of these, one usually simulates the man and as a rule is a masculine man's name." So we'll skip forward through time to 1933, and this article appeared in the Sun, and it lists 19 crimes in Maryland which take away the vote. And as we can see, sodomy is one of them. And then we'll skip forward a little further. After World War II, there was another rise when there's a lot of societal change. There were reasons reasons for this. During World War II, large numbers of men were thrown into same-sex environments, like barracks, and large numbers of women entered. And there was a post-war backlash to the New Deal and to the, quote, New Deal, Fair Deal, and Fairy Deal administrations. So that Sun reported in a June 1966 article that, quote, just because a person is, so if you're smart, you know, don't worry about it. According to historian David King 53 in 1955, more than 800 federal employees nationwide lost their jobs with, in the words of Senate investigators, files containing information. Lavender Scare also impacted government contractors. Employees lived in Maryland. And this article is from the Afro from 1965. The atypical men and are in government. Here are some Sun headlines that give you a feel for the kinds of continuing harassment that gay people faced in the second half of the 20th century. I'm going to be talking in more detail about two major police raids that occurred in this period. At about 11 p.m. Saturday night, October, Hyman Goldstein sent 2 patrolmen to check on the club. They found overcrowded conditions and, quote, evidence of homosexuality. So the club was raided. The fire department, the captain of the Fire Prevention Bureau, 5 police cars, and 6 wagons were called. All 162 people in the club were arrested and shuttled off to the police station in wagons, which made 24 trips in all. And by this time, there was a crowd of spectators, so they had to call traffic patrol cars as well. And it was a huge spectacle. At that time, it was the largest nightclub raid ever made in Baltimore. It was part of a cleanup of the block. We think of the block as the couple blocks of West Baltimore Street, but at that time, what was considered the block sort of turned around onto North Gay Street. So it extended onto North Gay Street. So the Sun on October 3rd states that most of those arrested in this raid were from Washington. And while this probably is not exactly true, there might have been a little truth to it. There might have been some people from Washington because as a result of the Lavender Scare, gay Washingtonians didn't really want to be seen in Washington bars. So oftentimes they would drive up to Baltimore where they would enjoy greater anonymity. So 162 people were arrested, 139 appeared in court the next day, and 5 were convicted of disorderly conduct. The magistrate was Meyer M. Cardin, who was Senator Ben Cardin's father. The club owners were charged separately a few days later with operating the club for, quote, the purpose of lewdness and assignation and as a disorderly house. The club was destroyed when I-83 was extended towards Fells Point. This is Richard's photo, and where that white car is coming through the under the underpass there is about where the club stood. Police were sharply criticized for the Pepper Hill raid. Delegate Jerome Robinson said, quote, "Other methods should be used in dealing with the public problem of massing homosexuals in licensed establishments." After a 4-hour trial for the club owners, where witnesses presented evidence of male patrons seen kissing and hugging, Judge James K. Cullen said police actions negated the disorderly house charges against the club owners, and he found them innocent. The courtroom broke out into cheers and applause. The judge stated that the police should have approached individual violators separately rather than making mass arrests. After all, the club was licensed by the state of Maryland, and it really wasn't a crime just being there. Police Commissioner James Hepron promised that it wouldn't happen again, and he, as well as the officers who led the raid, were invited to Annapolis to explain. And by the way, John Waters mentions getting into Pepper Hill as a teenager with a fake ID in his book, Role Models, which is on the Maryland Department shelves. Okay. So by 1966, there was an effort to solve this problem of, in Jerome Robinson's words, the massing of homosexuals by, in effect, banning gay bars. In April 1966, the Baltimore Liquor Board banned same-sex couples dancing together and female impersonation in Baltimore bars. All right, which brings me to Cicero's, which was in the 500 block of Forest Street. And that was also considered part of the block at that time. The block was sort of a district rather than a street. By the time of the 1971 raid, Cicero's was an after-hours milk bar. Here's a little history. In 1966, the bar lost its liquor license for 30 days. A liquor board member said that compared to this place, the block is a Sunday school. The patrons at that time were, in the words of a police officer, mostly butches, dykes, and femmes. Another police officer said, "Them lesbians, they don't have no respect for nobody." In fact, Cicero said he made women take off their neckties before he would serve them. One time a patron shot at, but apparently didn't hit, it was a male police officer shot at, but apparently didn't hit a female patron he had entered the women's room because there was a report of a woman with a gun in the women's room. And so the patron shot back. In January of 1968, Cicero's liquor license was revoked. In April of 1968, the liquor board imposed a $150 fine on Cicero's. An undercover cop posing as a customer had observed marijuana being smoked, solicitations for prostitution, sales of marijuana and amphetamines, and the presence of homosexuals and lesbians. And by the way, there were also Lumbee Indians who used to hang out there. On March 27th, 1971, in the early morning hours, a 13-man raiding squad arrested 100 people at Cicero's, including about 30 women and female impersonators. But rather than the orderly loading of patrons into police wagons, as had happened 16 years before at Pepper Hill, this time the patrons fought back. According to the head raider, Captain Simon J. Avara, we had to fight our way in and fight our way out as bottles, glasses, and ashtrays were hurled at the cops. So I call Cicero's Baltimore's Little Stonewall. It doesn't make a clean story because the police raid turned up all kinds of things like heroin and firearms, but it was all kinds of little things. But it was a Baltimore story, a Baltimore story of gays resisting. And this is what remains of Forest Street near the Old Town Mall. if you know where the Old Town Mall is. You can see the shot tower and the post office in the background, so you can kind of orient yourself there. And that is the conclusion of our program. I just want to say, we'll take questions, but before that, I just want to say we have a pile of evaluations in the back, and also a box of pencils. If you would be kind enough to fill out an evaluation, that would really help us to get support for this program. There are also books back there you can check out, and various other things. There are also, if you want to get on our mailing list for local historical programs, not necessarily LGBTQ plus programs, but programs having to do with local history topics, there are little pieces of paper you can fill out. And that concludes our presentation. Are there any questions?
Actually, before questions, I do want to say one other thing that's going to be on the back thing. Not actually for this program. There is a proposal from the Anne Arundel County Board of Education next week to ban high flags. There's information about that on the back table. There's a little QR code you can look at and phone at. Think about that. If you're here, it would be great if people could hear you and know that you, even if you don't live in Anne Arundel County, are a member of the community in the area, and that this impacts you. So, any questions folks have? I'll have to think on that. And the answer is, I'm sure that there are. Locally, I can't think of anything in John that I generally look at. But I know that there are stories of people that actually generally